What up, people? It's your boy, Massachusetts, out here with another video. First and foremost, happy 2022. Happy very late 2022. Yeah, we're in the middle of January, but it's still a good way for me to say what's up and hey, we're in 2022. Yeah, sorry for that. But anyway, you know me, Massachusetts, love my animation, love my comics, love the nerd culture, and I'm going to try to do more this year and see where I can go forth. I've seen, increases in my videos, but that's neither here nor there. Um, as of last one, as of last year, I've been trying to get back into certain things. One of those things has been Gundam, and I got into Gundam actually a few years ago, 2018. I started watching it from the beginning, wanted to um, really understand this particular IP, this particular brand. And, for all intents and purposes, Gundam started the modern day animation. It's what made it cool, where, without new types, we wouldn't have the Saiyans, we wouldn't have all this type of stuff, it was the first game changer, I would say, that it's what got people really taking anime, or it sowed the seeds of anime to be taken seriously. Granted, you had Speed Racer back then that predates this, but Mobile Suit Gundam 1979, it's definitely the turning point. And I was watching this, and then I kind of fell off in like 2019 or so, where I stopped at Gundam X, basically. Um, so I decided to say, you know what, let me get back into Gundam. And I thought that, maybe I should start where I left off, which would have been the remaining episodes of Gundam X. But, you know, I said, let me start over. Let's start from the beginning. Let's get something straightened out and really appreciate it. And there's some things that you could have missed that you missed it then. And that's why I want to begin, you know, my review of this thing. I do believe that Mobile Suit Gundam is 79 is, you know, a very well crafted story. And it definitely laid the groundwork for its future incarnations. So, I'm going to get into certain topics of this animation, characters, and the themes, and then my conclusion. So let's get into it. The animation should just be quick. This was obviously done in 1979. And of course, the picture right here is from it. Of course, it's been cleaned up with some HD and whatnot. But for the time, it was probably on the par with the Speed Racer animation, slightly cleaned up and a little bit better. But at the same time, we see that as the series progresses, I believe it was 43 episodes, we see that the animation kind of gets better in some aspects. This time around, we get to see mech fights. Of course, it's the first time they really included mech fights to get into the whole thing. And of course, that requires a certain level of animation and whatnot. So it was definitely good like that. The animation is something at its time. It should be one that should be taken seriously. So that's pretty much it for the animation. The story, let's get into the story, because the story, it's more or less is pretty basic. You have two factions, Earth Federation forces and the Principality of Zeon. And of course, this is at a time where, the Earth is starting to grow and people, and, you get some issues about, the environment, but, Earth's trying to grow and mankind decides to take its destiny to space. So they build colonies and whatnot. But as we can see, there begins to be a disconnect between those who have formed a new way of life in space and those who are still putting the Earth's will on the colonies. So we split into two factions. We see the birth of the Principality of Zeon and of the Earth Federation forces. And that's when we see war breaks out, basically. Of course, as you know, everything begins to happen. people have their disagreements, and for the most part, what's interesting is that they make sure that that the that you would think that Earth would have the advantage, but quite obviously not. It makes sense for the Principality of Xeon, who's been in space, to have the advantage, as most of these fights are taking place in space. Earth Federation force outposts being attacked. They lack the pilots. They lack the mechs, and they're on the brink. And this is the beginning of what is known as the 1 Year War. The story itself, evolves. We see our main character, Amuro Ray, with his best friend, Frau Bo, and we meet up with, his other neighbor, Hayato, over here. Kind of, come together, and their colony is attacked, and they find refuge on the White Base, which is commandeered by, a young, bright Noah. And everything that's said, they go about, and on this White Base, they decide to fight it out for their survival. It's initially for survival to eventually get back to, a major Earth Federation's post where, those who want to leave can leave and be done with it. But as we can see, though, we see that the more they try to escape, the more they're dragged into the war. So most of these guys here started off as refugees, basically. But everybody here, and even the kids right here, all continue to stay on the White Base. Ooh, sorry, had to pause for a bit. But that's where I was saying, yeah, they're fighting on the White Base, fighting for their survival. In the end, we see them go to Earth for a good period of time, fight some more battles, and then eventually hit the climax where we see them face against the Principality of Xeon, and they do win the war. But the story is that how essentially these children become soldiers, and it has the effect on them. But we also, in addition, get to see the emergence of a new type of pilot, a new type of people in space, new types, as they're called in Gundam. And we see that Amuro is slowly becoming one, but not only him, one of his chief rival throughout this show, Char Aznavour, who is also could be said to be a new type. And we see more new types emerge very, very much late into the series. It doesn't become even a concept until in the middle of the second half of the series. So you just think that these guys are just pilots, somebody who's, who started off lucky, as Amuro did, by just getting to the Gundam, and as battles go on, he just gets better. So that's pretty much the story for that. But it's a compelling story nonetheless, which I'll get to in the themes. But right now, we want to get into the characters. So watching this again, first time I watched it, I just accepted Amuro Ray, who is the main protagonist, who is the number one pilot for the White Base. That's just an okay character. He was, didn't have any necessarily any defining traits about him, but he was the protagonist. Upon the second watching of it, I learned to really dissect his character quite a bit. This is a kid who, his mother is on Earth, his father is in space with him, parents are split. Amuro is the type of character that, as the series went on, started to grow on me slightly, but then I also got to see some weaknesses of him. Amuro is displayed as a type of, he's obviously a prodigy, good with robotics. That comes from his father, of course. And we see that, he goes in and he's able to pilot the Gundam, which is obviously in the show, the Gundam is treated as a top secret weapon for the Federation forces, obviously, to change the course of the war. And we see him not necessarily progress with the skills of the Gundam, but we see how his attitude shifts from one of a civilian being put into an unfortunate circumstance to an eventual soldier. We see that as Amuro begins and moves about the story, he initially thinks that, oh, I'm just going to pilot the Gundam to get us from point A to B, but that turns into being conscripted more or less forcefully into the Earth Federation forces. He becomes a pilot. He experiences fatigue. He feels overworked because, granted, he is their best pilot. He is their best pilot, obviously. And so he begins to have a lot of this unwanted responsibility of ensuring that everybody survives, as well as his own survival, and more or less also winning the war for the Earth Federation forces. And it begins to take a toll on him. He becomes more despondent. That type of, I guess, any type of optimism, he would like to see gone. And that doesn't help that his family life is not good at times. We see that with his father, it's kind of odd because we see in the show his father's pretty sane, and I think Amuro doesn't know it. But in the show, it shows that his father's accidentally blasted out of the colony into space, but he doesn't die apparently. But he has suffered. His brain has suffered lack of oxygen, which has caused him to go in a weird mental state. And when Amuro sees his father for the first time, he expects, camaraderie, but his father only cares about the Gundam. He starts yabbering off gibberish and creating junk that thinks would improve the Gundam's fighting. It doesn't, and Amuro's despondent. When he gets back to Earth, he initially has that hope and feeling. When he sees his mother, they embrace, they have a good type of feeling. But when Amuro is found by some Zeon forces, he has to fight, he has to shoot, and then his mother is completely despondent, saying that you've become so violent, you've changed, and that kind of ruins any type of happiness that they have. So it's pretty bad. But we do get to see his ingenuity. We do get to see his drive. Even as the war goes on, his confidence is not lost. We do see him get more disciplined, thanks to Bright Noah, as he pretty much says that. He initially says that I don't have to do it. I'm the best pilot. You guys should do this and that, and he learns that he has a responsibility more or less to this crew and to his friends, which have essentially become his new family and whatnot. And we see that over the course of time, he essentially grows up into becoming a man, more or less, who has his flaws. And we have to remember that he's a 15-year-old pilot. And most of these, most of these people here, save for maybe one, are all under the age of 20. And so they're very much, teenagers fighting a war, which is, it's not good. But unfortunately, this is what the show displays as the war goes on. The next character I want to go through is Severin Ball, which is obviously he's the second main character in this whole thing. He's the primary antagonist / anti-hero. And initially he's portrayed as a captain in the army of the Principality of Zeon. He is considered the Red Comet. He is instantly the best pilot initially in the whole show until he meets somewhat of a match with the Gundam and Amuro. Clearly, he's smart, he's suave, he has charisma, and you initially see him as somebody who takes pride in being Zeon's best soldier. But what we also see, much like with Amuro, and I'd argue that Char goes through a better character arc than the main protagonist, is that we see that he has his own agendas, he has his own drive. He's not loyal to Zeon because he is the son of of the um, of the original founder of Zeon, along with his sister Sayla, basically. And we see that has sworn revenge on the Zabi family, who mainly run, the entire principality of Zeon. Basically, they're in charge of the whole thing. They're the ones that run it, and as it's explained within the show, the head of the Zabi family, the head of the Zabi family, basically. I'm trying to figure out. Remember why I said basically the head of the Zabi family, basically killed Char's family, Char's father, basically, and took over and ran Zeon in his own image, as opposed to the way that Char's father wanted to run it, basically. Yeah, Degwin Zabi, basically, and we see that he's the head of it, and we see that Char, as he goes on his revenge, decides to take out all the members of the Zabi family. Well, most of them. Most of them. We see that initially, someone who thought he was a friend, Garma Zabi, was killed in a very, interesting way. Well, not really killed, but left no other choice but death by Charles Nabal. And he managed to cover it up as it was more of incompetence than malicious murder. But we also see that he decides to go in and eventually take out Celia Zabi, which essentially she was the last remaining Zabi figurehead, not taking into account Minerva, who is born in this show, essentially destroying the Zabi family. So he basically more or less ended the war or ensured that the war was over by taking out all the political leaders within the Principality of Zeon. We also see that he cares about his men. He goes into battle first. He always likes to pilot his suit. He's a very effective leader. He commands respect with his men. He is essentially an all-out and great leader, and you can see that he knows how to essentially run an operation. His beliefs, as they're mentioned in here, is that he does believe that man's destiny is beyond the planet Earth. That that was the purpose of the principal. That was the purpose of Zeon, basically, for humans to reach the next evolution in play. And we see that he is also what one would consider to be a new type. But this show, even though he is more or less the primary antagonist, despite the Zabi family and whatnot, we see that there's a good chunk of the of the show where he is not seen because he is punished for incompetence concerning the death of Garma Zabi. And so the show does a good job to still have his presence loom, but to not as to say sprinkle him in doses, but know when to put him in to jumpstart the show, to keep it fresh because he's that popular. So we do get to see though that Char's relationship with Amuro, because they don't formally recognize each other as pilots of the Gundam and himself until almost 10 episodes left within this show. For the most part, they have crossed paths where they don't even know. And, at the same time, when they have crossed, they don't even know that they're piloting, that Amuro is piloting the Gundam. He just thinks it's a regular soldier. But every time that they've met, until the very last part, we see that, Char is a man of honor. He doesn't try to attack him. He just says, hey, let me help you. Let me do this. Let me do that. And, they go. Because, of course, Char is the older one. He's just a level of experience and, etiquette that he does have. It's not until getting into the character of Lala, and we'll get to her pretty much next, do they really have more of an ingrained rivalry and a little bit of a deeper, connection as well. Um, so let us get to the next character, which is Lala Soon. Now, Lala Soon is a character that was introduced getting into the far end of this series, basically, of Mobile Suit Gundam 1979. She definitely is the confirmation of a new type. She basically lived to serve Char, admires him greatly, and Char really liked her as well. But before we even do that, she met Amuro more or less, and Amuro was more or less smitten by her basically, and there was a deep connection. And I always believed that their relationship, Lala Sun and Amuro's, made no sense at all. For Amuro to necessarily be that emotionally attached to her, even though, spoilers if you don't know, Amuro is the one that caused her death in battle, by the way. So you can say that her impact was not so much as her being alive, though she did have some impact. It was her death, because to that day on, that's when Amuro and Char became bitter rivals. Basically, Amuro blaming Char for involving her in combat, for involving her in war, that a person like Lala should not have been fighting. Where, of course, Char's own reason for Amuro is that, of course, Amuro killed her, basically. And I would argue that the effect of her death had mostly negative consequences on both men. But it continued, and it will continue, and it continued until the sequel show, Mobile Suit Gundam Zeta, and into the movie Char's Counterattack, basically. I'm going to do two more characters mainly, but I'm just going to continue that Sailor Mass, interesting character, sister of Char Aznavour. She basically serves. You get a little bit of here and there, more about the past of Char, because they're both brother and sister. And she's basically someone of integrity. Was a faithful officer in the Earth Federation forces, and really grew on people. Hayato, Amuro's friend, not much to say. He was another pilot. Um, Basically, you don't get much from him or out of him, but that's just the way it is, basically. Um, the next person that's you also get you also have you also have Frau Bo, who is like the best friend to Amuro, love interest, basically continue to love him. Always at the expense of Hayato, who ended up marrying her in the sequel. And I'll probably get to that. But they stuck thin and through and everything like that. The kids, basically, Katz and Kika, and Let's have moments. They're mostly for comedic relief and to kind of bring some levity to some scenes. You also have basically Mirai, who is basically, I want to say, the first mate of the ship. She basically pilots the ship. Pretty nice person, brings wisdom to it, basically. Now, the last two characters that I want to bring in, or even before then, you have various antagonists within the show as well, and they're mostly with the Principality of Zeon. Characters like Makuve, Ron Boral, and the like. The thing is that with Gundam, Char was really the more primary antagonist. So a lot of the other antagonists were like one-off challenges, generals, captains who would eventually get defeated in the heat of battle, more or less. With the Zabi family, you see Cassilia planning, but you don't get much of her. She's like, more or less like the brooding villain. You know, more more or less. And you have Giran Zabi, who later becomes, like the figurehead. He adopts some, let's just to say, some fascist ideals, basically, considering those who live in space to be the superior human beings to take over and whatnot. And that's pretty much how the zombies are. Um, except for maybe Dozo Zabi, who was, I guess, the oldest, loved his wife, loved his daughter, Minerva, for as long as he got to see her, and he died in battle. Now, two characters that I never really thought much of, and I'm now getting to that, um, would be those of Bright Noah and Kai Shida. Now, Bright Noah, I'll start first. He's 19, but by pure necessity, because the original commander of the white base ship was essentially wounded heavily in battle, and he later does die. The responsibilities of commanding a ship falls onto Bright Noah, who's 19. And it's an interesting juxtapose to Amuro Ray. Now, granted, Bright was, he was a military guy. He was a military person, basically. He has, or at least has, had an expectation of what was expected of him as a soldier compared to Amuro. But what's interesting is that he's learned that he had to embrace that role, embrace that duty, basically. He captains the ship. He was a lieutenant junior. He was a lieutenant junior and became a lieutenant. You see him grow in the ranks. He realized that I am controlling this ship, and all these people have a responsibility to me. And one could argue, even though he didn't have the luxury to afford to complain, like Amuro, who was a civilian, you could argue that he could have complained because this was commanding a whole new ship, one as sophisticated as this ship, managing troops, managing battles, planning them at 19 is no small feat. And we can see that he does end up getting ill, but he respects his crew. He has no problem delegating authority. He has no problem holding everybody accountable, despite whether they be man or woman, because he knows that, hey, we've got to go in and survive, and it's my responsibility, and we're fighting a war. He ensures that he's very diplomatic. He tries to ensure that people are taken care of. He has honor. He knows the rules and sticks by them, and that is pretty much the makings of a good soldier. So he's a very underrated character, a very underrated character indeed. And that leads me to the last character I'll cover, which is Kai Shiden. Now, Kai, I would argue, also has one of the most extensive arcs. Even though it ends abruptly, it's still one to take care of. Now, I didn't really pay much to Kai during my first watch of Gundam, but when I watched it again, you really get to see the growth of Kai. Kai is also a civilian. Kai is a very self-interested person, cares only about his survival, only happened to be on the white base because it was his best path to survival in his mind. And what's interesting is that he's a pretty good pilot and a pretty good soldier. And he knows how to, pilot the other mobile suits that aren't the Gundam. And we see that, he gets better, but he doesn't like to take orders. He really doesn't deal well with authority. And when they finally get to a part in Earth on the base, when they finally officially get conscripted into the war, he thinks that, you know what, I've had enough. I am going to quit. And he pretty much tells the whole crew that, hey, I'm done. I'm quitting. I'm going back. I'm just going to go and live a regular life now as a soldier. And, he leaves. But what's interesting is that, there's an episode where he meets this girl named Miharu, who, she essentially has a family, but he knows that she's spying on the Federation for the Zeons because she needs to provide for her brother and her sister. And when the White Base is under attack, he just looks at the ship in his civilian clothes and he's like, I don't know why I should be leaving, but my man goes in and rushes into battle. Rushes into battle, basically. He becomes a corporal from into an ensign. But, as he rushes into battle, he gets back to the gun tank, into another mobile suit, and begins fighting. And he joins the White Base again as a full-on soldier, realizing that he can no longer be self-interested, that he has people he cares about on this ship. And we see that when, Miharu dies by, you know, by an unfortunate accident, we see that it affects him greatly. It changes his mindset. He becomes more team oriented. He realizes that, I can't have people die the way that she died. And so it turns him into a more honorable person, somebody who wishes to fight the good fight. And I really appreciated that with Kai. And you see the growth. And he becomes a character that you like to see in the later shows that follow in this Gundam IP, specifically, excuse me, specifically in the Universal Century, which is the timeline that this takes place in. So yeah, that's it for my characters. What about my themes? My themes. Obviously, things like war, um, human survival are definitely the main themes. We see that, hey, the effects of war on people, the effects that war have on children, the effects that war has on soldiers, even participants of war. We see that the war affects everybody, and we see that war is not even confined to space, but it's confined to Earth, and it's being fought on various different planes. And we ask ourselves, oh my goodness, war is still continuing to go on, and what happens if we become our enemies? What happens if we lose? What happens, you know, just on the edge of everything? What can we do? We also see themes like, you can say the environment plays a role because we see that we get to still see real beauty on the earth, but we can see why people say they left for space in the first place, to let the earth heal, to protect the earth, to not pollute it so much, to not use nuclear weapons to destroy it, on and on. This is Japan in 1979, which was, now over almost 30 years removed from World War II. So the effects of nuclear proliferation are definitely still in this show. You would think that in a setting where there are space colonies and mobile suits and mecha fights and space travel, that nuclear weapons are still not an option, but they are. They're very much so a grand option, and they still present the same problems that are still there. So one has to wonder, when will it end, basically? You can also say, the idea of um, responsibility. Like, am I responsible? When is it my responsibility to fight in a war? When is it my responsibility to look over those who are in a ship that I captain, or their lives I put in my hands? Can I handle it? Can I do it? Is it up to me? Should I even have the responsibility? Just various things that you can learn from Gundam. And it's just, I marvel at what you can learn, from good shows like this. Animated shows, basically, but Japanese anime in particular. and all that. Various themes within this show. So now I'll get to my conclusion. Watching this again, I obviously missed a lot of things, but at the same time, um, watching it again allowed me to really appreciate, good storytelling. Gundam is where I believe that, as I stated in the beginning, is where animation and anime really kicked off into high gear of having certain more mature plots, having certain means of storytelling that I don't think that anime before 1979 really had. Um, the idea of new types and what they can do, having certain abilities, is what I think bled into things like Dragon Ball and Bleach and all that type of stuff. Things of battles of taking in attack battles taking place in space gave you birth to things like Outlaw Star and Cowboy Bebop and all of that type of stuff like that. And of course, mechs would give you the rise of shows like Zoids, basically, as well. So Gundam definitely set the trend, and in terms of not just animation and story concepts, but in general of how the genre would move forward decades after its creation. So that's it for me. Um, if you like this video, please like, share, and subscribe, and hit the notifications. Once again, I do these videos for you, the people, because I want to, discuss good stuff like this, Mobile Suit Gundam, and other things like that. I will say this: I am looking to improve my videos, and if anybody is willing to, tell me what one could do, please do. Please, I beg of you. I'm a avid digester of new knowledge. So, once again, thank y'all for watching, and I hope to see you soon. Peace.